Since its founding by Jesus Christ over 2,000 years ago, the Catholic Church has faced attacks. Numerous hostile governments, tyrannical regimes, and revolutionary movements have sought to destroy the Catholic Church from without. But the greater threat has always been from within. In every generation, the Church has contended with heretics over questions concerning the very essence of the religion.
In history, there have been erroneous understandings of the revelation that God has made in Christ.
A heresy, it's not simply a falsehood, it's actually a truth, but it's a truth that's been broken off from the whole, so it's a partial truth.
In this series, we're going to look at the great heresies. We'll see how the ideological struggles of the past are anything but fossilized subjects, but rather living temptations with which the Church must contend again and again.
Heresies never really go away. The ideas that are attractive to people in the first and second century still seem to have a lot of attraction for people today.
Along the way, we'll see how the doctrines of the Church developed and gained clarity in the Church's struggle with heretics, and we'll have a deeper awareness about what's at stake today. We'll explore all this and more on the heresies. December of 1945. Two Egyptian farmers were digging for fertilizer near some caves in Upper Egypt. While working, they came upon 13 leather-bound papyrus codices buried underground in a sealed jar, a collection of ancient manuscripts which has come to be known as the Nag Hammadi Library. Within this collection of ancient texts, there were a number of Gnostic Gospels, accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus which differ in significant ways from Orthodox Christianity.
In the 20th century, especially around the end of the 1940s, there were some major discoveries of primary texts from groups we had previously known of only through their rivals. And these are generally attributed to the Nag Hammadi Library.
There's a perennial interest in the Gnostic Gospels. The presupposition here is that somehow the church that we have, the official church, the institutional church, suppressed a tradition, an authentic tradition of Christianity that existed for the first 4 or 5 centuries.
Just who were these Gnostics? And why did they bury their scriptures in remote caves? Do they, as some popular books and films would have us believe, represent the authentic and true teachings of Jesus, which the institutional church has concealed for centuries?
When we're talking about Gnosticism, we're talking about a big and sometimes rather slippery or ambiguous label. Most generally defined, we're talking about a religious movement that we can trace to the early Christian centuries, which tends to regard our salvation as coming through gnosis, or some kind of knowledge, especially a kind of secret knowledge.
If heresies in general are partial truth, a bit of the whole, what you have in Gnosticism is really is not so much a single heresy, but a whole system of heresies. It's an attempt to accomplish, in a way, everything that Christianity accomplishes through borrowing all sorts of elements from Christianity, from this great revelation and great tradition, but on very different terms.
To understand the Gnostic movement and its relationship to orthodoxy, we have to trace it back to its origins, roughly 300 years before the birth of Christ. Alexander the Great was one of the world's most successful military generals. As he conquered Persia, Egypt, Judea, India, and nearly everything in between, Hellenism, the world's first truly cosmopolitan culture, was created.
The ancient world, Greece, and then the sort of follow-on culture from Greece, Rome, which collectively comes to be known as the Hellenistic Age, Both the Greeks and the Romans had a very social view, political view, let us call it, of religion.
There was a sense of citizenship and of membership in a community, of belonging in a local community that was characterized by this word polis, or city. As that changes with the expansion of one civilization, especially the Greek-speaking civilization all over the eastern parts of the Mediterranean, all the way to India and into North Africa, some of the sense of membership or belonging to a local community is transformed as I see myself more a member of almost empire. One of the things that makes this Hellenistic period very similar to the modern age is one of the first experiments in globalization. You have uprooted tradition.
People start to develop these very syncretic kinds of approaches to spirituality. I mean, they're also all going to go off and sacrifice to Zeus or Jupiter, but then go and engage in, say, the rites of Isis and Osiris and things like that.
A central characteristic of many pagan religions was dualism, the notion that reality is split between two antagonistic powers, good and evil. These ideas were often expressed in elaborate myths and stories.
So you have in some of the religious practices that were being brought back into the civilized world from the frontiers, quite diverse spiritual attitudes. Some of them were very dualistic. This regards the material world as evil and good as being a purely spiritual principle. You do find in some of the creation myths coming out of Eastern religions, for example, the Enuma Elish, an account of creation that posits two original principles, a good principle and an evil principle that engaged in a kind of cosmic conflict and that produced the material world. So on that kind of cosmology, material reality is made, as it were, out of the evil principle, and therefore needs to be, in a certain way, surmounted. We need to escape it in order to escape the influence of evil.
Dualistic thinking was also a feature of ancient philosophy. The Greek philosopher Plato, who lived in the 4th century BC, taught that the objects we encounter in everyday life are at best images of a truer reality in a realm beyond. In his allegory of the cave, he likened human beings to prisoners chained in a cave. All they can see is the wall of the cave, upon which are cast shadows, which they mistake for the real thing.
In one of Plato's most important dialogues, known as the Republic, he has Socrates talk about what's real and the distinction between the world as we experience it as opposed to a world one could discover if you engaged in philosophy and a deep contemplative spiritual approach. And to explain this, Socrates uses the analogy, it's also sometimes called the allegory of the cave in Book 7 of the Republic, where he says, you know, those of us just sort of bumping along now are really like people living in a cave, and all we can see when I see you or I see things around me, I'm not seeing the real thing. What I'm seeing is a projection or a shadow, a sort of two-dimensional version.
A feature of his thought, both in this allegory of the cave and elsewhere, is that what we can sense, what we can feel, what affects our immediate experience is unstable, it's unreliable, it's changing, it's not true, because what's true is what is always and everywhere the same.
Yes, it's not clear that Plato himself has a very strong sense of dualism. And by dualism, I mean this separation of the dark material cave and the bright light spiritual reality. Others, however, will interpret, in later centuries, Plato's cave that way and really use it as a jumping-off point.
It was to this pagan world, with its elaborate mythologies and dualistic splitting apart of reality into good and evil, that the first Christians went out to preach the gospel. And while some accepted the faith on its own terms, many others incorporated the teachings of Jesus into their pagan framework. One such example was the heresy of Docetism.
Gnosticism is an early and serious mistake about the meaning of the person of Christ and the revelation of Jesus Christ. Docetism comes from the Greek word to seem, so dokein. It's an appearance. The idea is that God only appeared to be human, only appeared to have a human body. So insofar as any material reality is subject to change and also potentially to decay or to suffering, they would want to insulate the divinity from that. Desire to protect the divinity from getting intermingled with the changeable world.
Probably the only real Docetist document that we have is something that's referred to as the Gospel of Peter. And in the Gospel of Peter, which is a type of passion account, it states that Jesus only appeared to suffer. And in fact, during his entire life, what one would see is a type of phantom, not exactly a ghost, but something along those lines.
St. Ignatius of Antioch is one of the earliest Christian authors that we have text from after the New Testament. St. Ignatius, as he was taken prisoner and being taken to Rome where he would be executed, wrote a series of letters to Christian communities, and in them he very explicitly warns them against the false teaching of the Docetists. He's concerned that they negate the death of Christ in the flesh. And he thinks that when they do that, they are excluding themselves from the possibility of salvation. Very interestingly, the other major theme that St. Ignatius connects to the error of the Docetists is that they negate the truth of the Eucharist. Because Catholics believe, and believed in the time of Ignatius, that the Eucharist really is the body and blood of Christ, and that it really is, therefore, the food, the bread of immortality, and the antidote to death.
Up next, we'll see how the Gnostics of the 2nd century took the dualistic version of Christianity taught by the Docetists even further, with extreme teachings on morality and an emphasis on secret knowledge. Stay tuned. The Docetists interpreted the Christian message through the lens of dualism. In the 2nd century, a string of charismatic teachers would add to dualism an emphasis on secret knowledge, salvation through gnosis.
Generally speaking, Gnostics, which really developed, especially within Christianity, a bit later in the 2nd century, sort of mid-2nd century development and beyond. Gnostics, even more than the Docetists, going back to Plato's cave, believed that the way to spiritual development and enlightenment is primarily through contemplation. And so they will develop a very strong dualism of God. God, the good spiritual God, God, the evil creator God. And on that basis, a number of things are going to come into play for the Gnostics. One is a complete rejection of the Old Testament as being associated with the evil creator God. One of the more interesting groups are the Sethians, who seem to come out of a type of Jewish Gnosticism in the 2nd century. But one of the things that the Sethians do is they have a complete reinterpretation and a rewriting almost of the story of Genesis. They believe themselves to be followers of Seth, the 3rd son of Adam and Eve after Cain and Abel. And in their view of things, there is, as with many Gnostics, an evil creator God of the material world. And this evil creator God of the material world is trying to prevent Adam and Eve from achieving true spiritual gnosis, true spiritual knowledge. In this Sethian rewriting of Genesis, the hero of the story is going to be the snake, because the snake is the one who was encouraging Adam, in fact, to eat of the knowledge of good and evil, and it's the evil God who expels them from paradise.
For them, salvation involves escaping from the material world. Gnostics then are looking for a salvation that is purely spiritualizing, and usually that takes the form of a kind of secret knowledge. As you're initiated into this secret knowledge, you are able to escape the limitations of the material world.
What is this knowledge? Well, the Greek word for knowledge just is gnosis. So we're Gnostics, we're knowers. And if you come and follow our way, you'll no longer have to live on a level of belief or partial understanding, but have complete access, intellectual and otherwise, to the hidden mysteries of God.
The essence of it is a knowing rather than a believing. Why? Because the truth that you are looking for is simply inside of you. It's the true me, the divine spark. My salvation is already in me. And so I turn totally inward. I turn away from the world in order to recover this saving truth.
Another sect of Gnosticism were the Valentinians, led by Valentinus, an Egyptian who nearly became Bishop of Rome.
Valentinus saw himself as the person who should have been the next Bishop of Rome. It seems that Valentinus initially was a schismatic, but becomes more and more aligned with a type of Gnosticism, a spiritual elitism, and it's likely that Valentinus himself wrote one of the more important Gnostic works. It's called the Gospel of Truth.
According to Valentinus, human beings were divided between three classes of people, and only the spiritual or the elites had the possibility of salvation.
There are the Gnostics themselves who have this sort of self-revelatory experience of divine illumination. Then there's the psychics who are kind of in an intermediate stage from the Gnostic view, who need to have someone tell them. But then there's the vast majority of people for the Gnostics that they would call the bodily, the material, who are basically just brutes, and there's really not going to be any hope, any reason to think that they're ever going to be anything more than simply brutes.
So one of the distinguishing characteristics of Gnosticism is its emphasis on secret knowledge, that there are certain things that only insiders or the elect can know. If you ask me what I believe and what the Catholic faith is, I will tell you. A Gnostic will not tell you what he really believes until you go through various processes of initiation by which one is entitled to that secret knowledge.
The 2nd century church fathers, Gnosticism was a pagan distortion of Christianity. For saints like Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, Christians find solid ground in the teachings of the apostles and the apostolic tradition.
He was born in the middle of the 2nd century and probably died in 202 AD. So once again, we're very, very early in the history of Christianity.
Irenaeus of Lyon was originally from Asia Minor. And in fact, he knew St. Polycarp, who knew St. Ignatius of Antioch. So Irenaeus has something of an intellectual history back to Ignatius of Antioch. He comes to Rome as a young man and joins the school of another very important Christian teacher who's around the same time as Valentinus, Justin Martyr. And so he writes a work entitled Against the Heresies and Knowledge Falsely So Called.
One of the striking things about the way Irenaeus writes in opposition to the Gnostics is by pointing out that they do not follow the traditions of the apostles. Now, that's extremely important for us in understanding how the Bible was put together, because Irenaeus underscores, he really emphasizes, that the only reliable account of Jesus Christ are the accounts that have been handed on to us by apostolic churches. So we have there in Irenaeus a witness that the apostles really did hand on the truth about Christ, that the church has preserved a continuous lineage back to those apostles, and that is the standard by which you judge claims about who Christ really is.
While the champions of orthodoxy overcame the Gnostic threat in the 2nd century, up next, we'll see how Gnostic ideas continue to emerge in the church's history and where we find Gnosticism today. Stay tuned. The danger posed by Gnosticism in the 2nd century was ultimately thwarted through the efforts of the Church Fathers. However, Gnostic ideas would re-emerge time and again in various disguises, from Manichaeanism, Albigensianism, and various forms of Protestantism. And according to some scholars, Gnosticism has never been more of a threat than it is today.
Modernity looks very much like Gnosticism, and I think it's very disposed to following this kind of an ersatz Christianity. In the modern dualisms, you don't necessarily find an evil God who creates the material world and so forth, but the pattern soul is quite similar. And here, the material world is, rather than being evil, it's empty, it's meaningless, it's opaque. So similarly, with ancient Gnosticism, it doesn't reveal anything. It doesn't convey anything. It's not a manifestation of the divine goodness or the divine generosity. Instead, it's simply dead stuff. And as dead stuff is completely alien to us as persons. And so we feel the material world as a kind of an affront. And that's something like being a victim of the evil of matter. And so our salvation is something quite similar. We turn to a pure inward interiority. We think of the person as a ghost in the machine. And the reason that's interesting is, first of all, we see the material world is a machine. It's something that's not meaningful in itself. It's mechanical matter accidentally thrown together. But at the same time, we see that the soul has turned into a ghost. It's no longer the form of the body, which is the classical Christian understanding. Instead, it's been severed from the body, the soul has. And there, it's empty. It's pure power.
One of the characteristic experiences that seems to belong to living in a world that seems meaningless and where the most authoritative forms of knowledge in the culture reinforce the supposition that it is meaningless is anxiety, dread. It's surely not an accident that we have created a massive culture premised on escapism. I mean, what is a culture devoted to entertainment? What culture before ours would have thought to build Disney World, for example, or that would devote so much of its energy to different ways of anesthetizing ourselves?
I think Gnosticism is reemergent in our contemporary context. It has been for a while. And some of this dates to the late 19th century. There are a number of occult fraternities and things that show up around that time. And gradually, the contents of those things and their Gnostic outlook comes to be reflected across the religious and spiritual landscape of the 20th century and of our contemporary world.
One thing to note about the Gnostic tendency that you find today is that it tends to marginalize the sacraments, because the sacraments, of course, are visible or touchable realities through which an invisible grace is communicated to us. People who say, I'm spiritual but not religious, tend to mean something like, I have a kind of inner orientation towards some spiritual principle, but what I actually do with my daily actions or the way I go out and worship as a part of a visible community is not really so important. But in fact, for the Christian, being a member of the real, living Christian community is fundamental. That is the living body of Christ, animated by his Spirit.
The Orthodox Christian response to Gnosticism through the centuries has affirmed the goodness of creation. What is Orthodoxy's response to this new Gnostic challenge today?
The problem of Gnosticism was something that John Paul II was concerned about from the very beginning. Right at the heart of his project was overcoming a dualism. Now, what is the theology of the body? It's precisely the point, and that is that the material world has an intrinsic meaning. It's first of all intrinsically good, true, and beautiful.
Christianity has always believed, as did Judaism, in the goodness of creation, that the material world was product, the creation of a good God, and is good in itself. In that worldview, salvation consists in a restoration of that goodness of creation, not an escape from it. And we see this very clearly in the New Testament, that the hope described for salvation in the New Testament entails the resurrection and the restoration of the body.
Catholicism has always refused the easy solution to understanding the mysteries. The Church has always chosen not the easy path, but actually the difficult path, because the Church is being faithful to the mystery that has been revealed to us. I think there's no better response to a kind of contemporary Gnosticism than to return to the truth of the Incarnation, to grapple more fully with the deep mystery that God became man for the sake of our salvation.
The incarnation of Jesus Christ has never ceased to scandalize. And through the centuries, heretics have sought to make the faith more acceptable to human reason. The heresy of Gnosticism has been a perennial temptation for the Church, perhaps never so great as today. And it's the mission of the Church, as it has always been, to faithfully proclaim the Orthodox faith for the next generation. Thanks for joining us on The Heresies.